3. The breach with Schweitzer. It is a legend, but neither a true nor an agreeable one, that the German Lassalleans refused to affiliate with the International and took up a hostile attitude towards it from the beginning. In the first place, it is quite impossible to find any reason which might have caused them to take up such an attitude. It is true that they attached great importance to their own closely knit organization. But the provisional rules of the International threatened no sort of interference, and above all they could subscribe to the inaugural address from beginning to end and with particular satisfaction, to that section which declared that only the development of the cooperatives to national dimensions and their furtherance by state means could save the working masses. The truth is that from the very beginning the Lassalleans in Germany took up a friendly attitude towards the International, although at the time of its foundation they were deeply engrossed in their own troubles. After the death of Lassalle and at his testamentary recommendation, Bernhard Becker was elected president of the Allgemeine Deutsche Arbeiterverein. But he soon proved himself so incompetent that hopeless confusion resulted, and all that held the organization together was its organ Der Sozialdemokrat, which had been appearing since the end of 1864 under the intellectual leadership of J.B. von Schweitzer, an energetic and capable man who had done his best to secure cooperation of Marx and Engels. Without any pressure having been exerted on him, he made Liebknecht a member of the editorial board, and in the second and third numbers of the paper he published the inaugural address. The Paris correspondent of the paper, Moses Hess, cast suspicion on Tolaine, declaring him to be a friend of the Palais Royal, in which Jerome Bonaparte was playing the role of red demagogue. But Schweitzer published the letter only after having secured the express agreement of Liebknecht, and when Marx complained, he did his utmost to settle the affair amicably and ordered that Liebknecht should first edit everything the paper published concerning the International. On the 15th of February, 1865, Schweitzer wrote to Marx informing him that he intended to put forward a resolution declaring his organization completely in agreement with the principles of the International and deciding to send delegates to its congresses. His organization would not, however, affiliate formally with the International, solely on account of the German federal laws which prohibited the establishment of any connections between working-class organizations. Schweitzer received no answer to this letter, and instead Marx and Engels issued a public declaration breaking off all connections with the Sozialdemokrat. These facts show clearly enough that the unfortunate breach had nothing whatever to do with disagreements in connection with the International, and its real cause is explained quite frankly by Marx and Engels in their declaration. They had never failed to take the difficult situation of the Sozialdemokrat into consideration, they declared, and they had never put forward any demands unsuited to the Berlin Meridian, but they had repeatedly demanded that the paper at least should be no less audacious towards the government and the feudal absolutist party than towards the progressives. The tactics pursued by the Sozialdemokrat made it impossible for them to contribute any further to it. They still subscribed word for word to what they had once written on Royal Prussian governmental socialism and the attitude of a working-class party to such a tawdry deception. This statement had been given in the Deutsche Brusseler Zeitung, in answer to the Rheinische Beobachter, which had proposed an alliance of the proletariat with the government against the liberal bourgeoisie. As a matter of fact, the tactics pursued by the Sozialdemokrat had nothing to do with any such alliance or with any Royal Prussian governmental socialism. When Lassalle's first hope of arousing the German working class in one powerful onset proved to be a vain one, the Allgemeine Deutsche Arbeiterverein with its few thousand members found itself wedged in between two opponents, each of which was strong enough to crush it. From the bourgeoisie the Young Workers' Party had nothing to expect but stupid hatred, whereas it might reasonably expect that the cunning diplomat Bismarck would not be able to carry out his Greater Prussia policy without making certain concessions to the masses of the people. Schweitzer never harbored any illusions about the value or the aim of such concessions, but at a time when the German working class was practically deprived of the right to organize, when it enjoyed no effective franchise, and when the freedom of the press, of association and of meeting were at the mercy of bureaucratic arbitrariness, the social democracy could not hope to make progress by attacking both its opponents simultaneously and with equal energy, but only by playing one off against the other. Naturally, an absolutely necessary condition for such a policy was the complete independence of the new Workers' Party towards both sides and a firm consciousness of this independence amongst the working masses. Schweitzer pursued this policy with vigor and success. and it is impossible to find anything in the columns of the Social Democrat which savours of an alliance with the government against the progressives. An examination of his activities against the general political background of the day will reveal some mistakes, admitted by himself, but on the whole a sagacious and logical policy guided exclusively by the interests of the working class, and certainly not dictated by Bismarck or any other reactionary. Although in other respects Schweitzer was not the equal of Marx and Engels, he had at least one advantage over them, and that was a thorough knowledge of conditions in Prussia. They had no first-hand knowledge of the situation, whilst Liebknecht, upon whom the task of making good this deficiency naturally devolved, did not perform it at all satisfactorily. Liebknecht had returned to Germany in 1862 to found, together with the Red Republican, Brass, the Norddeutsche Allgemeine Zeitung. But hardly had his editorial work begun when he discovered that Brass had sold the paper to Bismarck. He immediately parted company with the paper. But this first experience on German territory was unfortunate not only in the sense that it left him once again in a critical financial situation reminiscent of the days of his exile. This did not worry him unduly because he was accustomed to placing the cause above his own personal interests, but also because it prevented him from obtaining an unprejudiced view of the new conditions he found in Germany. When he returned, he was fundamentally still the old 48er in the spirit of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which paid much less attention to socialist theory and even to the class struggle than it did to the revolutionary struggle of the nation against the rule of the reactionary classes. Although he was well versed in the fundamental ideas of socialist theory, Liebknecht was never a profound socialist theorist, and the chief thing he had learned from Marx during the years of exile was the latter's tendency to search the wide fields of international politics for any signs of revolutionary developments. As Rhineland as Marx and Engels were inclined to regard everything East Elbian too contemptuously, and they therefore underestimated the importance of the Prussian state. But Liebknecht was still worse, for he had been born in South Germany, and in the early years of the movement he had been either in Baden or in Switzerland, the two strongholds of particularism. He regarded Prussia as the Russian vassal of pre-March days, as a reactionary state which fought against historical progress with the contemptible means of corruption. A state which must be defeated before it would be possible to think of any modern class struggle in Germany. He failed to recognize how much the economic development of the 50s had changed the Prussian state and created circumstances which made the separation of the working class from bourgeois democracy a historical necessity. In consequence, any permanent understanding between Liebknecht and Schweitzer was impossible, and in Liebknecht's eyes it was the last straw when Schweitzer published a series of 5 articles on Bismarck's ministry, drawing a masterly parallel between the Greater Prussia policy and the proletarian revolutionary policy in the question of German unity, but committing the error of describing the dangerous energy of Bismarck's policy so eloquently that the description seemed almost a glorification. On the other hand, in a letter to Schweitzer on the 13th of February, Marx committed the error of declaring that although the Prussian government might adopt all sorts of frivolous experiments with the idea of productive cooperatives, it would not repeal the anti-combination laws and curb bureaucracy and police rule. However, Marx was inclined to overlook what he had himself so eloquently put forward against Proudhon, namely, that governments could not control economic circumstances but were themselves controlled by them. A few years later the Bismarck ministry was compelled willy-nilly to repeal the anti-combination laws. In his answering letter of the 15th of February, the letter in which he promised to work for the International in the Allgemeine Deutsche Arbeiterverein and again informed Marx that Liebknecht was being entrusted with the editorship of all matters relating to the International, Schweitzer declared that he would gladly listen to any theoretical advice Marx might have to give, but that in order to decide on practical questions and immediate tactics one must be in the center of the movement itself and have a thorough knowledge of existing conditions. Marx and Engels then broke with him. These misunderstandings and complications can be fully understood only in connection with the unfortunate activities of Countess Hatzfeldt, who sinned grievously against the memory of the man who had once saved her name from obloquy. She sought to turn Lassalle's creation into an orthodox sect upholding the words of the master as its supreme law. But even then it was not so much the word of the master as the interpretation Countess Hatzfeldt put upon it which was to be the supreme law. The mischief she did can be seen from a letter written by Engels to Weidemeyer on the 10th of March, in which after a few words on the founding of the Social Democrats he declares, "An intolerable Lassalle cult developed in the paper, and in the meantime we learned definitely that Lassalle was much more deeply involved with Bismarck than we had thought. A formal alliance existed between them, and things had gone so far that Lassalle was to go to Schleswig-Holstein to support the annexation of the duchies, whilst in return Bismarck made a vague promise to introduce a sort of general franchise and a rather more definite promise to grant the right to organize, to make social concessions, to give state support to the workers' organizations, etc. The foolish Lassalle had no guarantees at all that Bismarck would keep his part of the agreement, and he would certainly have been packed off to jail the moment he made himself a nuisance. The editors of the Social Democrat know this perfectly well, and yet they are keeping up the Lassalle cult more vigorously than ever. In addition, they let themselves be intimidated by Wagner and paid court to Bismarck, flirted with his ideas, etc., etc. We published a declaration and broke off relations, and Liebknecht did the same. It is difficult to understand how Marx and Engels, who both knew Lassalle well and who both read the Social Democrat, could have been taken in by the fantastic stories of Countess Hatzfeldt. But as this was the case, it was only logical that they broke off all relations with the movement which Lassalle had founded. However, their action had no practical effects on that movement, and even old members of the Communist League like Rosa, who had defended the principles of the Communist Manifesto so brilliantly before the Cologne Assizes, declared themselves in favor of Schweitzer's tactics.